Hello, listeners. This is Henaleva, Manager of Podcasts and Audio Initiatives here at Race Forward, and welcome to Momentum, a Race Forward podcast. On today's episode, we have a conversation between our very own Julie Nelson and our esteemed guest, John A. Powell, which was inspired by the essay they recently co-authored, Expanding Just Multiracial Democracy. Julie Nelson is the Senior Vice President of Programs at Race Forward. She was the founding director of the Government Alliance on Race and Equity, GARE, a joint project of Race Forward and the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California, Berkeley, where she is a senior fellow. Julie is the former director of the Seattle Office for Civil Rights, where she served 8 years, providing both vision and hands-on support to Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative, the first initiative in local government designed to dismantle institutional and structural racism and advance racial justice. She also served in other City of Seattle positions, including with the Human Services Department, Administrative Services, Seattle City Light, the Office of Housing and Seattle Public Utilities, as well as other positions, including with Housing and Urban Development in the federal government and with Pima County Community Services in Tucson, Arizona. John Powell is an internationally recognized expert of civil rights, civil liberties, structural racism, housing, poverty, and democracy. He is the director of the Othering and Belonging Institute, a research institute that works to identify and eliminate the barriers to an inclusive, just, and sustainable society, and to create transformative change toward a more equitable world. John has written extensively on a number of issues, including structural racism, racial justice, concentrated poverty, opportunity-based housing, voting rights, affirmative action in the United States, South Africa, and Brazil, racial and ethnic identity, spirituality, and social justice, and the needs of citizens in a democratic society. He is the author of several books, including his most recent work, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Concepts of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society.
John, I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. I so much appreciated the opportunity to co-author the essay on expanding just multiracial democracy with you. And I wanted to voice our appreciation to the German Marshall Fund and the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. The two of them together published the set of essays. Before we jump into talking about the essay, however, I thought it might be fun to talk a little bit about how we first came to work together.
I came up to Seattle. I think I first met you. You were giving a talk and it was brilliant. And then we started doing some stuff back and forth. I was at the Othering and Belonging Institute, although our name was different at that time. And then we started working together. I met you, I met Glenn, started working with the office. And then there was a mayoral election in Seattle, and the new mayor basically decided to let you go. And you had basically asking people to come together to acknowledge you and essentially say goodbye. And I was one of the final speakers. And it struck me just that the work you're doing was so important. And you're largely being let go because of political reasons, because you have been successful at gotten, I think, family leave at corporations, and the corporations didn't like it. And even the Star Tribune, which is the local newspaper in Seattle, basically said mayors get to appoint whoever they want to, but this doesn't make any sense. You're getting essentially fired for doing your job. And I thought, we too often bemoan when our leaders get attacked and don't do anything. And an attack on a leader like yourself is really an attack on all of us in the work you did. So I put a call out saying there are all these people, literally hundreds of people testifying to how you helped them, helped their children from all walks of life, Native Americans, Blacks, whites, Asians. And I said, we should do something. And I made a commitment that we at the Othering and Belonging Institute would do something. We take your work nationally if you were interested, but we didn't have any money. And while we were discussing it, some very established job offer came along that had money, that had health benefits, but wasn't quite as exciting. And I remember you asking me, should I take this job or should I take a chance and for us to do this national thing that later became GARE? And I said, it's your call.
John, I so much appreciate that point in time and the support that you provided. The fundamental question around, can we take this to a national scope and scale? you were the one who was asking that question, and your support over the past, I don't know how many years now, time flies, 6 or 7 years, where we have seen the Government Alliance on Race and Equity grow from a handful of jurisdictions to now close to 500 members. The question around growth and scale at that time, we've seen some results that have happened. So just really appreciate the support that you provided at that moment and over the course of the last decade. And it actually brings me to the essay that we did, the essay in thinking about the role of local government, the role of cities in addressing racial equity and creating cities of belonging. This is a time when we know that democracy is coming under attack across the globe, not just in the United States, but across the globe. We see a rise of authoritarianism, a rise in nationalism, and we also know that it's critical to understand the role that local cities can play, not only in defending it against democratic backsliding, but even more importantly, in expanding the very nature of democracy. I wanted to start with a question around thinking about the way that cities are positioned, and how do you see cities playing that role from a democratic practice perspective? What are the key things that you see cities doing?
Well, before I answer that question, Julie, I think it's important for our listeners to understand we went from, at the time that we started this, really under your leadership, it was mainly you in Portland, Seattle and Portland. And now, like you said, it's by some counts over 500 government units involved. But also this project you're doing with the German Marshall Fund was looking at cities in the United States and Europe. So our vision of trying to make this national was too small. And cities all around the globe have a role to play. And the backsliding that you describe in ethnic nationalism that shows up in the United States and Russia and Turkey and really all over. It's sort of well established now in the United States that people don't have a lot of confidence in government. For federal government, Congress is around 6 to 9% think they're doing a good job. And if you go back to the 1960s, it was 70%. And so something has happened. The number's a little better, and I should say a lot better when you look at local governments. People still understand that local governments matter to their daily life. Where the kids go to school, are they safe? It's issues around policing, it's issues around housing, it's issues around picking up the garbage, having your street lights on, or having a park, and having your voice heard. And I would say, partially as a work of CARE, but also Race Forward and others, our local governments increasingly are coming from our communities themselves. We're getting people elected. And so I think there's a serious role establishing or reestablishing trust and faith in government. And some of that lack of trust and faith, but a lot of times it's just bureaucracy and callousness. But there's also a danger in turning our backs on government. And so I think if we lose local government, if we lose our faith in democracy, I think holding government accountable and making them responsive to us is what we need to do, not sort of walking away from it. And Julie, it's sort of interesting because I know you were in Europe for a few months.
It was a huge opportunity as a partnership between the Othering and Belonging Institute and the German Marshall Fund. I spent 3 months in 6 European cities. The project was called Cities Fortifying Democracy. One of the things that the German Marshall Fund was really interested in was the ways in which European cities were talking about othering and belonging, how they're talking about equity and inclusion, and the ways that things are similar and the ways in which things are different between European and US cities. And one of the things that I was really clear in European cities was some of the coded language that gets used when we're talking about issues of race, equity, and inclusion. I think your point around democratic institutions and what's the level of care that's provided through the public sector. Much lower level of homelessness, hunger, some of those basics that are around investment in public education, investment in our neighborhood, just a whole different level of expectation around the public sector that I think that we can learn a lot from.
I think as you say, there are really important similarities and important differences. Europe does race differently than the United States, but it does it. Sometimes it denies it than it does it at all. We actually pivot to othering and belonging because we think othering is a more expansive term. And so when people might say, we don't do race, and you say, well, what group are othered? Groups are othered through different axes. In the United States, race is sort of one of those penultimate axes. And I think the goal is to really try to make a society that really functions for everyone.
So, John, in our essay, there were 4 themes that we talked about, and I wanted to have a center on that. Municipalities provide the opportunity to expand democratic practice at the local level. So my question for you, is there an example of that you'd like to lift up?
I think there are many examples. And Julie, I would come back to you because I think you've been the leader in this area in terms of having municipalities actually engage in democratic practices. And so one example, of course, is the streetlight example that happened in Seattle with one of the communities of color. So maybe you could share that with people.
The streetlight replacement was done on a complaint basis. And so if your streetlight got burnt out, it was the residents' responsibility to call and report it. There were all sorts of reasons why that complaint-based system didn't work so well in some neighborhoods. And so what the city did at the time was actually take a step back and look at alternative ways of replacing streetlights. Turned out that replacing streetlights on a geographic basis not only provided better service to neighborhoods, all neighborhoods, it was also more cost effective. And so it's a great example where thinking about the system and structure of government, us stepping back and saying, how can we accomplish that public sector service in a way that's going to meet the needs of people in communities?
I was going to say that's a beautiful example. And also what it suggests is that different communities are situated. So the more upper middle class white community in Seattle, the complaint system probably worked relatively well for them. But for a community that's newer to Seattle, as you said, that may not have speak language, English in the same level, may not have the same relationship with government. So you really have to be sensitive to the different needs of different people. And one way you capture that is through data. Who's participating and how, and then if there's a huge gap, even though we talked about disparities early, it tells you something might not be working.
And what you're pointing to is really the second point in our essay, that for us to expand democratic practice, we have to be explicit about groups that have been excluded, that are being excluded, and design policies and practices for inclusion and belonging. And I think it's one of the things around thinking about the history of our country and the ways in which democracy has been exclusive. And so for us to get to a true multiracial democracy, we have to be able to look at the laws, policies, and practices that created the racial inequities that we see today. And those laws, policies, practices, everything from voting rights to property to land, everything from that to interpersonal relationships, who could marry whom. And so the fact that we have those racial inequities, not random and it's not natural. For us actually to get to the country to which we aspire, we're going to have to be able to expand ideas of democracy.
2 things I would add is that we are dealing with what's called complex adaptive systems. So sometimes systems have unintended consequences. And so sometimes those consequences are deliberate. That is, people mean to keep certain people out, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's either not thought through at all, or even sometimes there's an effort to do something right and it actually makes it worse. And I can give a concrete example. Here in California, at one point, people realized that large class sizes was an impediment to learning, especially for low-income communities of color. And so it pushed through some bills through the legislature to actually have smaller class sizes. Multi-billion-dollar bill, actually supported by minority communities or low-income communities and legislators themselves. The effect of that, though, was to actually, so they made classrooms smaller. The effect of it was to pull experienced teachers out of inner city classrooms. So the classrooms got smaller, but the teachers that populated those classrooms became less experienced. The impact was a negative one overall for the students. That was the unintended consequences. No one had foreseen that coming. And so one thing I would say is that you had to be outcome oriented. One way of doing that, of course, is engaging the community itself. Sometimes we develop policies, budgets, ideas. We talk to people, we have a process. We have a review process, write a letter, come to a meeting. Again, oftentimes the same people come to the meeting, the same people write the letter. And the most marginal communities oftentimes don't show up. So we aren't getting their input. How do we do that? And I think, again, there have been a number of efforts large some through GARE and others, to get government officials out of their office into the streets, and not just into the streets, but really talking to people. We call that co-creation. And in order to effectively co-create, people need resources. They need information. They need support. We have examples like that, like the environmental impact statement. Well, it turns out I've worked on some of those. They're incredibly complex. They're long. They're tedious. They're turgid. So you put out this 300-page document and you say to the community, well, if you have any concerns, you got 60 days to respond. Well, it may be a sincere effort, but it doesn't work. Part of it is what I hear you say oftentimes, Julius, meeting people where they're at, not just designing something and then hoping it serves people. So I think local government getting out in the community, having community more involved is one of the most important ways of actually addressing some of these things.
One of the things that we've seen a lot of local government try out is participatory budgeting. It's been really successful in some cases, and in other cases, one of the things that we've seen from a design perspective is that it's designed to actually just provide access to the same populations, and it's a small amount of money. Where we have seen success is when participatory budgeting is actually designed to build the bigger we that you talk about, that it's not just a matter of providing access to people who've always had access, but building the bigger we so that when we're doing participatory budgeting, it's really inclusive and co-creating what it is that we'd like to see in our communities. I know in the city of Seattle, when the city council first started a small fund that was a couple of $100,000 to end systemic racism. That point in time, many of us thought it was a little bit absurd. But nevertheless, we used it as an organizing opportunity and brought groups together to plan for how do we end systemic racism. And now, over the course of the last decade, that effort has expanded. Now, a new effort with participatory budgeting that is looking at a $25 million fund, and it's directly tied to supporting investments in communities of color that have been harmed by systemic racism. So that's a huge shift that I think is really important from a democracy perspective. The next point that we really focused on was around not just thinking about individuals, but thinking about systems and structures. I know sometimes when we're talking about equity, inclusion, institutional and structural racism, othering and belonging, like when we're talking about these things, oftentimes there's a tendency for people to want to think about individuals and ways in which individuals might be experiencing harmful impact, but it's not because of them, it's because of our broken systems and structures. And in fact, when we work to fix systems and structures, it benefits us collectively. And we see that in our work across so many different areas, whether we're talking about criminal justice, housing and land use, healthcare, that it's just consistent across systems. And so wanted to hear you reflect about that focus on systems.
Well, I think that's critically important. One of the things we increasingly talk about, structural racism, structural racialization, or structural disparities. But oftentimes our work is organized around individuals. And so we want to find the individual races. We want to find the bad actor. We want to find the bad apple, quote unquote. And as someone says, what if it's not the apple? What if it's the soil? And so it's not saying we absolve people of responsibility. Bad structures undermine the work of good people. And so just a couple of concrete examples. If you think about the listeners who have seen that little slide where you have three people looking over a fence, and what we've done is to say, instead of having them be a different height, think about them all being the same height. The problem is not with them. It's not the person that needs fixing. It's the structure itself. And I say we need to be hard on structures and systems and more generous toward people. Seattle has been, as just one example, been under review in terms of policing. And it's not simply that they're not police of color on the Seattle Police Department, is that there's something more insidious going on in terms of incentives. If you think of Ferguson, what they found is that policing was tied to, writing tickets was tied to actually the city budget. How you paid for city services was to write a lot of tickets. And police, if they didn't write tickets, they would be punished. Well, that's the structure. It's not saying necessarily that this is a bad police or good police. It's a bad system. So we have to actually look beyond just individuals.
We sometimes talk at Race Forward about the fact that we can have entire organizations full of well-intentioned people, but because of the system and structure, we just keep getting the same outcomes time after time. And so for us to get to different impact, for us to actually move the needle and advance towards racial justice, your point around focusing on systems and structures is so necessary. And I wanted to pivot to, you referenced criminal justice. I'm thinking about going back a few years to the murder of George Floyd and the uprisings that took place after that. At the organizational level, we saw just thousands, hundreds of thousands of organizations that issued statements. After they issued their statements, they tended to want to send people to training. The reality of issuing statements and sending people to training is that does nothing to change systems and structures. And so one of the things that I would love to hear you reflect on is how it is that we actually change systems and structures, how we do the implementation so that we're advancing racial justice and expanding multiracial democracy.
You're exactly right. I mean, it was actually an incredible time all around the world, people going out asking for change. But most of the change that people were anticipated, and even some of the change that some of the social justice advocates asked for, was rooting out racism in the individual's heart or mind. And it's not saying that there's not some of that, but it paid very little attention to structures. But the structural problem is there. And once we become aware of it, we need to increase our capacity to see what structures are doing and then design structures, not even just remove barriers, design structures to produce the outcome we want. If we want people to thrive, we want people to participate, how do we design structures to make sure that's happening? And if it's not happening for one group, we don't assume that there's something wrong with the group. We just realize that the structure is more sensitive to one group than another.
I like your point around design. One of the things that at Race Forward and the Government Alliance on Race and Equity that we frequently talk about is using tools to insert racial justice into decision-making processes. And it's not that tools are an end-all be-all, but it's a methodology. So instead of just replicating status quo, doing what we've always done, we're inserting racial equity into decision-making. And then there's ways in which we can hold ourselves accountable and hold the organization accountable for the changes to which we aspire. And sometimes that's using a racial equity tool. The other thing that we frequently talk about is a racial equity action plan, having clarity around what it is that we're trying to do, why that is, the impact that we aspire to, and the steps that are going to be taken, who's going to do what when, and those interventions, that idea of moving beyond just talk or issuing statements or going to training, really thinking about implementation and organizing for multiracial democracy. It's a different level of accountability, really.
It's also the evaluation, right? We've done all these things now. We train people, we've had input, we've increased the budget. The groups that we're focusing on start thriving, the disparities start declining, or not. So how do you approach evaluation for outcomes in that process?
Yeah. So our racial equity tool, when I say that it's a methodology, the last step in the process is around evaluation and assessing whether the impacts that we were hoping for are the impacts achieved. And the truth is that racial inequities are deep and pervasive. And it's not like we just don't see single interventions being successful in creating the scale of change that we need. So oftentimes after we've tried something and we evaluate it, the question is, what can we do to mitigate any of the unintended consequences? What can we do to move the needle even further? That relentless focus on impact is something that is critical for evaluation, for us to actually move the needle on racial inequities.
Julie, one of the things you alluded to, and I want to lift it up, is when you talked about participatory budgeting in Seattle and starting small and then getting larger. And my guess is you learn some things along the way. So part of it, could you speak to the need to have space to experiment, to try and to learn?
Yeah. The space to try and learn, that when we think about the fact that the history in the United States of century after century of racial inequities being created, being built into the system, for us to dismantle that system, we need the space to experiment and to learn. But to be, just like I said, relentlessly focused on whether what we're doing is having the impact that we want. And so across multiple areas, like thinking about whether we're talking about health inequities or housing inequities, being focused on the end result, oftentimes there's different paths to get to that end outcome. And so for us to try different things and to figure out what works best for which populations, what works best over what period of time, in what localities, etc. It's part of the power of working within cities, coming back to the idea of cities being sort of the places of experimentation and the power of GARE organizing together, that what gets done in one city, that we have a network where people really learn from each other, don't need to repeat each other's mistakes, that when one of us figures out something that works, it really needs to be mimicked or replicated. And that's going to allow us to have the impact on a national basis. I'm curious, given the work that the Othering and Belonging Institute is doing around that idea of experimentation, are there any experiments that you're seeing that you're really excited about?
Yes, there are many. I mean, so one of the things we haven't talked much about is the future, right? So how to imagine a different world. We know we want a world where everyone's treated with respect and with dignity, everyone belongs. But what does that world actually look like? What do we need to do to get there? And so, and as you mentioned, there are all these different segments. Part of it is looking at schools, part of it is looking at taxes, part of it is looking at housing, healthcare. But part of it's also looking at stories. What's the culture that we actually imbue? And it's sort of interesting to me. So we actually play with culture. We play with, for example, one of our areas is civic engagement, trying to get people engaged to actually participate, not just in voting, but in going to meetings, having their own meetings. And we find that culture is really one of the things that works and gets people coming back over and over again. So we might have song or dance, work with the Native American community, traditional song and dance from their community. Because a lot of times, you think about a meeting, especially if it's political, oftentimes imbued with this hostility and feeling bad, and everybody come to the meeting feeling bad, and they leave the meeting feeling bad, and then you say, come back next week, give you some cookies. So instead, can we actually lift up? We also experiment with what we call moving from a asset frame from a deficit frame. So we know that oftentimes just describing the problem, even though it may be accurate, actually depress people's participation. And we're not saying hide the problem, but we're saying give people an arc where there's a possible solution. Give them a way to actually engage that's productive. Turns out to be much more important. We're constantly testing the impact of what we're doing to see how it's landing in terms of outcomes, in terms of people, in terms of attitudes. And sometimes there's some genuine surprises. And there's sometimes things are as we thought they would be. And then the last thing I'd say is that within our work, we have belonging as a belonging for everyone. Really, what does that mean? And we think of belonging as inclusion 2.0. We think of targeted universalism as equity 2.0. How do we actually get people grounded in that? And then what difference does it make? And from our now fairly substantial involvement, it makes a huge difference in terms of people feeling positive, people being engaged. So we think we're onto something, building on the work that we and others have been doing now for decades.
So, John, I know we're getting close to the end of when we need to wrap up. As a wrap-up question, if you're talking about 1.0 and 2.0, what do you see on the horizon? What is the 3.0?
I think you sort of touched on it earlier when you talked about a larger we. Seems to me one of the very simple ways of saying this is that some people believe the world is only made for their group and everybody else is to be exploited and doesn't really count. And then I think there's those of us who believe we all belong, not just to our own group, but also to each other and to the earth itself. That's a very powerful story that not only acknowledges the past, but it builds toward a future. To me, that's the 3.0. Can we actually, at every level, culturally, structurally, institutionally, engage in a practice where everyone belongs? And I think that actually calls not just to act differently, I think it calls upon us to be differently. It calls upon us to actually engage our own identities in different ways. And it also allows us to talk about a number of different ways in which people are other, whether it's because they're disabled, whether it's because they're poor, whether it's because they don't speak the dominant language, and whether it's because of their race and or their color. As we sort of address those things, how do we address them in a way that makes sure those groups belong, even while the groups who are slightly better off also belong? So I think the work of GARE in the United States really do need to be global. The language of belonging is the right language. And I think looking at the structures and institutions to make that happen is the way to do that.
Well, I appreciate that. And I also appreciate the way in which you were talking about the desire to not just focus on what we don't want, but what we do want. And I know at this point in time where there's such an increase in authoritarianism and we see attacks on democracy, it's easy for us to focus there, but for us to really be able to have our strategies, but also to move towards what it is that we want. That it's not just that we're creating a bigger we, but it's a better we.
There's a lot of fear mongering associated with authoritarianism. And so I think part of the thing is how do we actually, as I say, quiet the reptile? How do we, the part of the brain, sphere based, how do we actually quiet that enough to we can move forward? And again, it's not hiding the ball. It's not talking about hard things, but I think giving people a sense of the possible is really important. And even having people have space to have fun, to enjoy each other, to enjoy life, to enjoy the earth, not hiding, but realizing that life is complex. And so I think some of the Race Forward's events, I think, you sort of pull in time for people to celebrate, time for people to actually commune with each other, moving toward that bigger and better we.
Well, John, thank you so much for being on this podcast together with me. And I look forward to our future work together.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Momentum, a Race Forward podcast. And once again, a big thank you to John Powell and the Othering and Belonging Institute for making this episode happen. To listen to even more of Momentum, a Race Forward podcast, check us out on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And remember, you can support our work by texting RFPOD, that's RFPOD, to 44321. Every donation supports Race Forward's audio work. Visit Race Forward on social media at Race Forward on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we'll see you very soon for the next episode of Momentum, a Race Forward podcast.